Okay, welcome everyone to the final panel of the day called the Trust and Transparency in AI, Aligning with Stakeholder Needs. My name is Håkon Gjerløv. I'm a senior researcher here at PRIO, and I was invited to moderate this panel, which went with the working title Nerd Panel. Because we have now brought all the technicians up on stage to talk about their views on transparency and AI and the use of AI. And I assume most of them generally like to talk about it as machine learning and not AI, but that's a conflict we will not bring to the table today. So with us we have Ylva Grønningsæter, who is a Security Engineering Research Associate at Center for Artificial Intelligence Research at the University of Agder. We have Katayun Kishi, Head of Data Science at Ashleigh. We have Alexander Malaga, data scientist at Econ AI and Conflict Forecast, the Conflict Forecast project at Econ AI. Yeah. And we have Ashleigh Landau, research associate at the Early Warning Project for the Simon-Skjodt Center for the Prevention of Genocide of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. And finally, we have PRIO's own Simon van der Maase, senior researcher at PRIO. Okay, perfect. That's the panel. All of these people, they work on various models. They are technicians. They care about weights and programming and all of the technical aspects. But in the light of trying to be transparent and have transparency, I've challenged them to just prepare like a 3-minute talk through of their model, of what they're working on. So we're going to start with an opening round for that, where each of them will present at least one of the things they are working on and what that model can currently deliver. That sounds pretty much from what I've challenged you to do. Perfect. We'll start with Simon, and I think we have even some images for the television. If that can be started with Vera, she will help me do that.
But I can also start talking while images are being seen. There. This is a picture. I will get into what is a picture of in a second. But views produce forecast of expected conflict fatalities. And we produce forecast 36 months out into the future. We have 2 levels of analysis. One is country level forecast, and the other one is this PRIO grid cell level, which is what I will focus on because that is, I think, one of our most kind of interesting endeavors. And a PRIO grid cell is a grid cell that is approximately 55 by 55 kilometers, at least around the equator. So imagine a map of slightly large picture covering the world. We have data about what is going on in these pixels in terms of violence. We get data regarding violence and protests from the UCDP and from Ashleigh. We have a lot of other data, data on population, data on different socioeconomical issues, data on migration and climate. Some of that data is of higher quality than other data. It's hard to get good data on these levels. But so we try to use this data to then also predict on the same kind of grid level what is going to happen the next 36 months into the future. And this, we have one pipeline that is running every month right now and producing new predictions, but this is the one that we will be launching pretty soon that is a bit more involved. And this just shows how we like to think about it. We have a lot of different machine learning models, and we do that because they all have strengths and weaknesses. Some of them include different features or different variables that allow us to look a bit of which variables help us make the best predictions. We can get back to that in terms of if that constitutes explainability. But we experiment with our models, and we have this thing called Viewser, which is a big database where we put in a lot of data from different providers, and we try to create models that are very good at extracting predictive signals from this data. And once we like the models, they go into the big pipeline, all the models. And models can either be shadow models, meaning that we don't really use them to produce predictions. We just see how they do and whether or not we like them or not. They can be baseline models, which is models that we try to measure our models again. Because we have multiple fancy metrics that say how well our models is doing, but sometimes it's easier to have a baseline model that might just tell you how well would you have done if you just said the next month will be like this month? You will do pretty good in conflict because country is sticky in time and space. So at least we want our machine learning models to be better than that, to be more useful, to give you more information than you would have. So all the other models that we like and that we think are useful gets into production. And we take the combined prediction of these models and make an ensemble. So that is like a panel of experts. And we ask the experts, what do you think will happen? And then we have a couple of checks seeing, how do we think these predictions look? Do they look, in the realm of possible predictions? Have they changed a lot since last month? Is that due to some error in our data or because something scary is happening in the real world? And then afterwards, it goes out to a prediction store that then feeds our predictions to an API that our users can go and get our predictions from, or use the dashboard on the Views website. That is basically the View system in a nutshell.
Perfect, thank you. And before we just quickly move on, can I just also then ask you, so what you will show to the stakeholders or the users in this room, that's the prediction of what?
That is imagine the small pixels.
Yeah.
And then in that pixel, for the next 36 months, how many expected fatalities do we think will occur as a result of violent conflict?
Okay.
And that, of course, has a lot of kind of spatial and temporal clustering in the system, and that shows pretty well. One of the nice things about the kind of the PRIO grid level is that the cross-border diffusion that happens in a lot of conflicts becomes very kind of visible and very clear. So.
Okay, thank you. Ashleigh?
All right, wonderful. Thank you so much. So as was mentioned, I work in one of the centers in the Holocaust Memorial Museum. This is a part of the museum that tries to help governments and organizations prevent and respond to mass atrocities around the world, contemporary cases of mass atrocities. One of the core flagship programs of the center is our Early Warning Project, which is what you're seeing here on the slide. And the Early Warning Project uses both quantitative and qualitative tools to assess and spotlight the risks of mass atrocities around the world. And one of the sort of core components of the Early Warning Project is our statistical risk assessment. So our risk assessment gives us the quantitative ability to forecast the likelihood of a new onset of intrastate mass killing in over 160 countries. And really, this risk assessment was developed to help policymakers, practitioners, governments really determine where they should be devoting time and attention and additional resources and ultimately preventative action. What you're seeing here on the slide are sort of just two ways, we have other ways, to visualize the results of our latest risk assessment, which is something that we do every year. So you see a heat map, which is quite interactive. You can click in on any of the countries to see their risk scores, to see variables that are important predictors. But you also can see we have a ranking system as well, which is very easy, I would say, for policymakers to use, and risk probabilities as well that go along with those ranking scores. This is all done through a machine learning algorithm that is essentially learning from the past. So in essence, what the model's really asking is it's asking what countries today look most like countries that have experienced a mass killing in the past, and really what did they look like in the year or two before onset. And then just to end, the model, of course, has its limitations like any model. But it is really great for helping you to sort countries in the world into these categories or levels of risk. It's also great at showing you where risk might be increasing over the years, or showing you countries that might be consistently at high risk. And then lastly, of course, also good at highlighting or spotlighting unexpected risks and countries where experts might disagree with maybe what the model is showing. But yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. And one more follow-up for you as well. Just quickly, I noticed that you talk explicitly about onset. So ongoing atrocities is kind of thrown out of your model. You care about potential onsets.
Yeah. So definitely we didn't throw it out the model, but that was absolutely one of the core foundational reasons for creating the tool, as you can see in the name, it being the early warning project. We really wanted to focus on situations where there wasn't large-scale violence already taking place, to hopefully give policymakers sort of a window of opportunity to actually implement programs and prevention solutions. But yeah, I think that will probably come up in some of our other questions about one of the struggles of communicating that these rankings and risk scores are about potential new onsets and not the escalation of an ongoing mass killing.
Thank you. Alexandra Malaga?
Yes, hi. So I'm coming from EconAI. I work at the conflictforecast.org project, where we focus on predicting any violence intensity, but actually our focus is on armed conflict, onset of armed conflict in the next 12 months. And we do it by national level and PRIO grid level. And the key features that we try to exploit is LDI topics from the news sources. Right now we're using 5 news sources, but we are in the process of adding like 17 sources from Australia and Asian countries. And we will have news about that soon in the following months. And we are also implementing a subnational model up to admin 2 level. So, well, Conflict Forecast project started with Hannes Müller and Chris Rowe at the Institute for Economic Analysis in Barcelona. But it is expanding because now we are working for EconAI. Now we also try to predict institutional disruption, coups. We are using also displacement by country and by a dyadic of countries using Google Trend searches. And we are also focusing on treatment effects because causality is important for so many questions. So, for example, one project was about getting the impact of peace agreements on any violence, of the onset of any violence, controlling by the risk of the situation before the intervention. Because that's one thing, the intervention treatment effect differs depending on how is the situation in the moment they decide to intervene. And then the following step to that is probably a development that we are trying to start, hopefully it works, that comes from that project initially. It is that eventually, as trust is gained, as our models improve, then policymakers are going to start to make decisions on the forecast that we are making. And this policy will affect the risk and will mitigate the risk. And if we don't consider these policies in our models, then our models are going to start to learn that it overestimated the risk. So it will start to make our models obsolete. So one thing, the first step is to build a policy intervention data set. And it could also help to answer some of the questions about the whys, because from what I'm getting from the room, from the previous panels, is sometimes the why, the why question, you are giving me a forecast, why is this going on, comes from an idea of I need to intervene. And to intervene, I have several policies, and these policies depend a lot on the why. So the one possible way of our forecast to be more useful on the whys is if we have a policy intervention data set that we can actually say, if you intervene this way, our forecast is like that. If you intervene this other way, our forecast turns like this. And that may be more useful. So we are exploring this dual system algorithm that explains treatment effects on one end and forecast targeting, because as it was mentioned before, this is a policy targeting problem, right? A policy prediction problem. So that will be, I don't know if I covered everything. Oh, maybe.
Thank you.
Yeah. Was it?
I think it was perfect.
Good.
Yeah. And it's great that you got into the policy aspects. That's definitely something we're going to continue talking about.
Good.
Kata Junkeshi?
Yeah. Great. Well, I have something new and different, a conflict forecasting model. So this is the Ashleigh conflict alert system. So we look up to 6 months into the future, and we create monthly forecasts of organized armed conflict around the world. So that's things like battles, explosions, remote violence, violence that targets civilians, cases like that. We cover every country in the world in which there are enough events to cover. And we go down to the admin 1 level, the subnational sort of province level in each of those countries. What you see on the screen here is sort of our general dashboard that also links up to an API of a data stream, basically, if you'd like the information that way. We do try to make an effort at explaining the why behind the forecast that we're making. So the chart on the right-hand side sort of gives you a step-by-step of how we arrived from a baseline estimate in which we're not factoring in any other predictors in the model, purely looking at the history of the admin, and then sort of how each of the various predictors that we included in the model contributed to the end outcome that we ended up displaying. And then we also sort of make an attempt at transparency by having a whole separate sort of tab on accuracy as well. So we present each month what we predicted would happen the prior month, what ended up actually happening, what the differential was in the terms of the number of events that we were off by, and also how much that as a percentage of the overall activity in the country that constitutes. In terms of the accuracy of the model, it's really hard to say at a global level because some countries perform much better than others. As you can imagine, overall, we're typically within 5% of events. In some cases, we are predicting the exact number of events that will occur the next month. In some cases, we're wildly off. I mean, it really depends on the type of conflict, the history of the conflict, and so on. Just really quickly, a few of the improvements that we're looking to make in the coming next few months. One is to make this accuracy element of it much more front and center. So really provide the user with, this is what the forecast is for Mexico, and Mexico is a really good candidate for conflict forecasting because we typically see only an error rate of, plus or minus 5 events in a month. And we think this is a tool that would be really useful for looking at conflict in Mexico. And so it gives people a quick sense without needing to necessarily go and look all that information up themselves. And we're also looking at ways to integrate a bit more of a qualitative element. So at Ashleigh, we have a lot of experts and researchers that work for us that we have been asking over the months to create their own forecasts. So what do they think is going to happen? And we've been testing that against what the model says. And really interestingly, in a lot of cases where the model predicted incorrectly, our researchers are actually predicting correctly what will happen. So we're looking at ways to, whether or not we can statistically integrate this into the model is really tricky, but we can at least try presenting this as sort of in tandem. So this is what the sort of human researcher experts are saying, and this is what our model is saying. This is the trajectory that both of those are taking, and here's maybe a brief explanation of why we're landing there. And all of this work is sort of feeding into a larger project that we have that looks at conflict signatures. So can we look at conflicts really specifically, the actors involved, the geographic spread of them, how they're sort of evolving over time, and determine based off of that unique signature of that conflict, how it might evolve later on in time. So thanks so much.
Thank you. Can I also just ask one follow-up question here on the accurate? You talked about within 5% of events. Does that include all of the zero events? I assume that there's a lot of zero events.
Yeah, we typically even would leave out the zero events from the dashboard here just because it doesn't really add a lot of information. So among the cases where something happened, we're within 5% globally, but much more accurate in some cases and less accurate in other cases.
Okay, thank you. Mm-hmm. Okay, final. Ylva Grønningsæter.
Yes, so I'm working on something that is very different than all the other ones here. The formatting came a little bit different, but yeah.
That's my fault.
No worries. So I'm from the Center for Artificial Intelligence Research, and what you guys probably think about when I say artificial intelligence and machine learning, you think about the neural networks. So what we are building or working on is something called the Settler machine. So this is a new type of machine learning algorithm that came out in 2018 and was invented by my professor, Ole Kristoffer Galmo. And then you might ask, okay, why the Settler machine? Why do we need this when we have neural networks that achieve good accuracy and performs really well? You have heard earlier today that people describe them as black boxes. This is true. There have lately been models that have or neural network models that have billions of parameters, probably up in the trillions now. And so they are very computationally expensive, and you can imagine that they're very not explainable, like billions of parameters. Like they're very big models. And so that's why we want to explain this path further on. And just to make it really clear is that there was numbers from a 2020 paper that came out in 2020 that compared a transformer model and looked at the carbon footprint of training that model. And it compared it with the lifetime emission of 5 or 6 cars. So it's very not environmentally friendly if you think about it. And that was only 213 million parameters. Now there's like billions of parameters. So we have to look at or explore options on how we can go further, explore other paths. And you know that the neural networks, they're inspired by the human brain. And the settling machine differs in that way that it's inspired by the digital computers with its bits and logical operators. So that also makes it more hardware friendly and also more environment or energy efficient. And if I want to quickly explain what the settling machine is, it's basically a combination of thousands of settling automatas, and if you combine that with propositional logic. And propositional logic for us humans are very understandable. So if I were to train a model, for instance, to recognize the class dog, a rule that it would learn from that from training on data on dogs would, for instance, be very abstract, by the way. So if 4 legs and 2 ears and tail, then dog. So it's very explainable to us to understand. And so, yeah, it's transparent, and that's why we want to explore this path. And it has done really well on black and white images. And that's why the next natural step now is to explore color images, where I come in. That's what I've been working on. And so that's what you see in architecture there is what we used now for our latest research. And that is basically a little bit interesting to what you talked about by combining a lot of different models. That's what we did. We combined a multiple range of settling machines that are trained on different views of an image. So, for instance, you get an expert on, for instance, edges in an image. Then you get another expert that is trying to look at the color texture, for instance. And together they make more accurate predictions by having a majority vote. And so what you can see on the left is the CIFAR-10 dataset, and that's most often that's used for benchmarking machine learning models on color images. So we're at the early stages, but it's looking so far really good. And yeah, so what I want you to guys get out of this is that it's more environmentally friendly and it's more explainable, and it's ongoing research. So yeah.
Thank you. Now we're really diving into the nerdy side.
Yeah,
of
I'm
things.
sorry, I tried to.
That's propositional logics, totally understandable to humans. No, that's excellent. So, and you use this to classify images.
Yes.
That's the baseline what you're doing. You're using it for, right?
Yeah, but you can use it for much more like natural language processing, regression, and yeah, and also they're investigating causality, so causal models.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah.
We're going to continue a lot of the conversations that we had in the previous panel from the viewpoints from a lot of these more technical people. But things could get really nerdy if we allow them to just stay by themselves. That's why we really want to open the floor quite early. I'm going to challenge them with one question, but then we really want to open the floor in order to engage the conversation between the more technical people and users and stakeholders. Okay, but the first thing I really want to challenge the panel on is, you now present your model, but what do you find to be like the most difficult thing to explain to someone not in this game, to funders or to policymakers?
I can start. It's a super simple thing that has been kind of raised already. So obviously there is a lot of people working as practitioners that have the same background as us, that are maybe social scientists that came in and started doing data scientists, and maybe they have a data scientist background. And it's very easy to communicate with these practitioners. But when you have stakeholders that are not used to working with these models, then, for instance, when we try to present them in constituents models, or we try to show them different features, what is most important, then as Geraldine also said, then they're like, oh, so this variable is most important for maybe genocide. And you go like, no. That was not what I said. I said this variable has contributed with the most signal to create the predictions that I have. I have no idea, of the causal path. That's, that's a whole other kind of thing to put on top of it. And it's a really simple thing. And understanding where we get the predicted signal from is super important when we are making our model, right? We are all interested in where our signal come from. But a lot of the time, our policymakers are not that interested in where the predictive signal come from because they are asking the why. And those two things get conflated, I think, often, which is a bit frustrating.
I can jump in. I think one of the most difficult questions I get asked is not even so much about, really rarely anyone asks, how is the model constructed? Like, what is the algorithm you're using? Even the questions about explainability, I don't get as often as general questions about accuracy, which I think can be addressed with the various ways that we all show accuracy, but more so like, how does this model fit into my decision-making workflow? How can I actually go into work and use this? And that's really difficult for us because none of us work in those places. And so we're just at best guessing what their workflow is and how this might be used in it. So I don't know if the answer is having perhaps just much more targeted conversations with these end users, of maybe even first having a conversation about, okay, you tell me what your workflow is, and then I can prescribe to you how this might fit into that process. It obviously is very time consuming for both us and for the user, but maybe that's the answer to getting further ahead. But I do think, going back to what Håvard was saying this morning in the first panel, we're building all these tools. They exist, they're out there, and no one's using them, but that's for a reason, right? Like, we obviously haven't broken through yet to what is it exactly that people can integrate really at low cost resources to themselves.
Well, so coming from that end, I would say is more than this causality correlation is what these tools are good for. And we have several tools to address different problems. So if you want me to address a question about forecast, then I can use the model that I am using. Because I am using as much data as I can that can be useful to signal what event I want to flag. So a bit, I think there was this example when I was at university. It was, well, I can watch umbrellas in the street and predict rain. If people are carrying umbrellas, I can predict rain. But it's not that the rain is happening because of the umbrellas. So when I am in the forecast task, I am mostly thinking on adding as many data that has probably no relation with causality. But that's the tool to do forecast. And there is another tool, a bunch of tools on treatment effect, on causal inference, where you get regression discontinuities, experimental, to kind of manage an experiment in the information that you have, such that you get enough variability to predict a treatment effect. But those are different tools that answer different questions. So if you want this other question, then I can give you this other tool. And that helped a lot while working with some of the stakeholders that we have at Econ AI, because, for example, for some of them, we managed to create models targeted to their own needs, such that they can implement what we are predicting using their own policies. So the models are targeted to their policies. That worked, I believe, pretty well. But then we are worried on the next step, which probably we are not wondering much about, is years are going to pass. These models are going to be used. And these models are going to affect our models because policymakers are acting on our predictions. So we have to start to worry about that, maybe looking forward. So yeah, those will be my two insights on it.
I think just something that you might have picked up from all the comments is when we brief policymakers and we brief these audiences, there is a lot of engagement. I think that is something that maybe those of you who don't do this sort of work might maybe not expect, but there is a lot, which is fantastic. So we do get a lot of questions, where does your data come from? How does your model work? What's driving risk in specific countries? So I think just as a starting point, I think that's a positive in the field, is there is a lot of engagement in people wanting to understand, wanting to be able to tell their bosses, how this model works so that they can potentially use it. But yes, I think a lot of the similar challenges that we all get, so the causality aspect is a big thing. I think policymakers, they naturally don't have the time. They want to know exactly what is driving or causing risk in a specific country. And that's just not what most of our models, maybe Ilva, yours might be excluded, but are designed to do. So we've got to become creative, I think, in the ways in which we present the model and how we can actually pinpoint influential variables, but not variables that one should design their whole, prevention program and policy action based on. But then, of course, I think there are other things like revisions to your model. Anytime you make a revision to your model, you change your algorithm, or you drop a variable, you add a variable, and that causes changes to your results or shifts in a country's ranking. Those are always challenging to explain as well. And then, of course, accuracy metrics, I would not say are the easiest thing to explain to an audience that doesn't have the technical background. But yeah, definitely we have our own unique challenges with our work. Mass killing events are fortunately rare, statistically rare events, but that also means they're very hard to predict, and we have very limited data. So a lot of the challenges come in, having our results are small probabilities, and a policymaker might, not know what to do with a small probability of a very large-scale event that might happen.
Yeah. So because like a recurring theme is the issue of, so they order something, they see a forecast, but they want to know what to do with the forecast. That seems to be a very recurring topic both here and in the previous panel, right? But the people in the room that are asking for these models, so they want to have their cake and eat it too, right? They want everything in this model. The lucky good thing for you is that they also have the money to pay for it, right? So what do you need them to pay for, right? So what do you need? Like, why can't you make this model now?
They're not paying enough. It is a bit of a funding thing, because that has been pointed out. I think Joel was also, what did you call it, pilotless or something? It is one thing to create a cool early warning system and write a paper and maybe even get it published in a cool journal. But going from that to create an infrastructure where you had all your checks, that's a lot of hours on top of it, like exponentially more hours. And especially if you are funded by UN agencies or different kind of research funds. A lot of these research funds are not catered towards big building of infrastructure. Every time you get a new research grant, it says that we are supposed to produce something new and marvelous, crazy science. And we try to do that. But we also have, an increasingly large code base that need maintenance and update. And nobody finds that super sexy. Nobody is like, here you have 10 million euros to update your code base. People don't want to do that. And that is a bit of a challenge in the long run. Yeah.
Maybe another... Oh, go ahead.
No, I was just thinking just in general, like I would imagine manpower and also computational resources, like the big team that actually achieve a lot in terms of AI. They have a huge amount of resources, like huge data centers and everything. They have these huge models and also access to a lot of data. And I can't imagine that small research centers have that kind of access to these funds. And in addition, that will limit you a lot in this field.
Oh, sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
Okay, so I believe it's also a matter of trust that we have been talking a lot. And I believe it's like with any technology, for example, cars, we were doing this example before. At the beginning, they were mechanic, and then they became automatic. My father knew how to fix his own car it was always bad, but he was doing the stuff. And he knew and he understand. Now I have no idea. I open a car, I have no idea. But it was a matter of generations for us to start to rely on a machine that actually holds my life and that it will work. And I guess it's going to be the same for these AI applications. It's a matter of time, building trust, of flagging with good accuracy or precision or recall or that the measures that we're using when events are happening. And yeah, we just have to improve our models and yes, money, because policy intervention data set, and could you imagine how much that's going to cost? So yeah, money, trust.
I would say that I don't think we need more money necessarily spent on model development. I mean, not no money, but less. I would say spend money on building out other data sets that we can use in our models, because there's a real lack of, when you leave the conflict space, like, not to toot Ashleigh's horn, but like we are a conflict data set, right? Like a weekly updated global conflict data set. It's so difficult to try to find a data set on all these other kind of metrics that we think matter for conflict that are updated, that are globally available and updated weekly. So, and once you start incorporating data sets, so say I have a model, right? I'm forecasting conflict on a monthly level at the province level geographically. If I start introducing a data set on, I don't know, economics or population or whatever other factors I think matter for conflict, and that data set is at the country level, or it's only updated once a year, it doesn't matter if I include it in the model or not. Nothing will change about the model. It just gets thrown out when I run the algorithm, basically. So we need more diverse sets of data that are spatially disaggregated and temporally disaggregated so that we can start using them in the models we're building. Otherwise, we're just relying a lot on really just conflict data and really repeating kind of what we are seeing happening in these countries.
Really short, Simon, then we open the floor.
Because I have, so to two of Katarina's points that I really want to touch on, if it's okay. So the first one is that, right? If you look at UCDP and you look at Ashleigh, we have better worldwide data on where people dying than where people are. I just talked with Geraldine. The population data is way worse. It is crazy to think that we know more about where people die than where they are. That's just wild. So that is a huge thing. I couldn't agree with you more. And then you said earlier, you talked about, making sure we talk with policymakers about what they really, really, really want. And I think that is so keen, because we talked about the bicycle and the dashboard and everything, and Geraldine talked about the OLS model, and the OLS models is a bit the policymakers yearning for the bike, being like, but I could see all the gears, and it was nice, and it was safe. And we tried to tell them, yes, sure, but you didn't know how fast it was going. You were just guessing, right? As Paula says, people are not as good as parameters estimates in those models as they think they are. But it's known. But with the whole car kind of analogy and the dashboard, we are assuming that people wanted a car. They wanted something with a roof on that could drive fast, and we built it, and that's cool. But we are not really, the thing, as you say, the thing that we are building, we are really, really hoping. And I think if we get better at building the exact thing that they want, maybe even the thing that they know they want, but the thing that will be most useful. As Håvard Nygaard was talking about, if it comes in and it is, unreasonably useful in their way of working or allocating resources, then it will be easier also to trust. It's like an airplane. It is unreasonably useful to take an airplane if you want to go from Oslo to New York. Any other mean of transportation is annoying enough that you don't care about how the airplane works. You just take it, and you cross your fingers that it will fly again. So. Yeah, sorry, that was my call.
I like that. Unreasonably useful. That's good.
Thank you. We'll then open the floor. I already have a hand from Samar here.
Thank you so much. I have a lot of things in my head, but I'll just stick to one point. So you guys discussed about different things, and there was a word stakeholders again and again coming in, and you just talked about policymakers. I would like you to unpack what stakeholder is. And I get the impression that these things are being developed without any aim. You guys are developing it, and then the aim comes later on. Like, policymakers want something that we are not able to deliver. What's driving you guys to develop these things? Like, what is the goal? Is it just prediction? And then I am thinking, who is it going to serve better, the policymakers or the corporate world, which is they have a lot of stakes in developing world, and maybe that's what perhaps you guys might be aiming for. I'm just trying to see, because my background is in regulation of emerging technology, so I'm a bit of a Luddite here. The point is, I'm seeing how do you balance these interests when you talk about stakeholders, and especially because you are designers, things are in your hands to a great extent.
Yeah, I would just say, and our organization might be a little easier to explain, but I would say there 100% was an aim in the beginning. The aim was to give policymakers, which in our opinion are governments, are organizations, multilateral organizations. That's usually our primary audience, with secondary audiences being practitioners and scholars, but giving them a resource so that they are actually focusing on countries at the highest risk, so that they can focus on those countries, devote resources to those countries. So very much, I think that was the aim in our project. So I don't think it came after the fact, but definitely, as other panels have mentioned, we see this lack of focusing on prevention and early warning, and even in a lot of models and a lot of multilateral organizations, we're focused on responding to crises and even predicting, escalation in, 6 months or something. But there is not a lot of work that's done far enough that we can actually implement preventative programs that will actually prevent the conflict from starting in the first place. But yeah.
Well, in the case of Econ AI, I believe this project was presented here at PRIO too. It was about, instead of targeting in the next year, it was targeting in the next 3 years or even 5 years, because the interventions were in diplomacy. So, and to which countries take a look a very long time before something happens. And in this case, since it was, the work was with a diplomacy agency, it was also focused on the impacts that they were more interested in. So try to connect the predictions to actual impacts that they were interested in. And then to make a model that at the end answers the question, which places should I prioritize now that we expect that something might happen in the next 3 years, and considering the cost of not intervening. And this is more or less the cost. And they decided which dimensions of cost they were interested. So at the beginning, we show a general framework that can be adjusted to the needs of the institution that is using this, because each institution has their own policies, and for that policies, different targets.
I'll say that at ACLED we have a lot of different stakeholders. So we have anywhere from journalists to small nonprofits like local partners that are focused on a very specific conflict on the ground, to governments, CSO, for example, State Department, the Germans, the Dutch, etc. So it really runs the gamut of users, which also means they have a wide variety of needs and specialities, right? So we don't, I think, presume to build one tool to rule them all. We are very targeted in terms of, I know a journalist doesn't need the whole 9 yards. They need a quick answer to the question of how many people died in Myanmar last month. So we're providing a tool that allows them to really quickly get that answer. Whereas I know that a small NGO that doesn't have their own data team could really be reliant on something like CAST, because they don't have the resources to build out their own forecasting model, and they would rely on something like this. Whereas someone like Gray's team is really advanced. They don't need my models and my data and my tools at all. They can download the data set and integrate it into their existing systems. So I do think it's a good question about, you have to be really thoughtful about the different users that are going to be interacting with your product or your data set, and really thinking about what is the conflict lens that I want to present to these people. So what is the view of conflict that I think is most important for them to make sure that they're picking up on, and that's my responsibility as someone that is an expert in the different types of conflicts that we're seeing. Am I presenting it to them in a way that I think is most useful for them, but also is the most accurate way that they can then go on and use that data.
We have a lady in the...
Yes, hello. Thanks very much. Very interesting, and to see also these different models. I just had a question back to the sources again, and I'm not going to ask you just like generally about sources, but I was wondering, for those of us who deal with kind of conflict prevention and these issues, we are quite acutely aware that most of the, conflict is not a neutral thing, and you have different narratives, and I think also we see also in the social media and the media now very much this kind of battles of narratives, and which also... I just wonder in terms of like, how does this impact, or do you incorporate these kind of concerns when you also kind of host your data and harvest your data? And, does this impact, because I mean, of course you use more kind of statistical data, but it's still, I'm just wondering whether those kind of concerns also play in a role when you create the models.
Which concern, sorry?
About the kind of non-neutrality of conflict. And I just wonder, I mean, I don't know, at least we experience that on the ground, that when we talk to different actors and things, that the information you get is also, there are different narratives, there are different, what do they actually provide you, where do you get, so for us actually, where you get the information is important. And I just wonder, and I'm not talking so much about the coding, but more about the kind of, the back information that you feed into the systems.
I can speak to this in terms of the sourcing. So the CAST model relies really heavily on ACLID data, as you'd expect. So the sourcing that we use to even create that data itself about what's happening in all these countries around the world. So it comes largely from secondary sources. So we're looking at a wide variety, though. So anything from news at the international level all the way down to the local level. We're listening to radio. We're looking at, in some cases, our researchers are going and like physically picking up a newspaper in their local areas to read it. We have local partnerships on the ground with organizations that are themselves going out and witnessing these events and recording them and then passing them along to us. And then in some rare cases, we also use social media, but that's sort of for vetted accounts and so on. So what all that means is we have a dedicated source list that's unique to every country of only sources that we trust, so that we can triangulate all of the events that we're seeing. So if we see something happen here, it's likely that some of the other sources in our list are also mentioning it. We present like fatality information, for example, really conservatively. So if we see it in multiple places, we typically try to report on the most conservative. We also go back and update the event information itself if more information comes out about it. And really importantly, we do all of this in as many local languages as we can. So we cover, it's about 3,000 sources in total across 100 or more different languages. So we don't rely only on English language, because like one of the best examples of this is if you look at conflict events in Yemen. If you were to only use English language sources, it looks like conflict dips in December in Yemen. And it's like, when do you think all the journalists are going home for Christmas? So if you look at Arabic language sources, you see that in fact, it stays pretty constant in terms of the amount of conflict that you see. So it's really important to us to have that mix of sourcing, as rely on local sources as much as we possibly can, and also in non-English languages as much as we can. And that all then, we feel confident in that base that then feeds into these machine learning models that we built.
Can I add to that? So Views doesn't collect any of our own data, but we partner up with ACLID. We get your data, we get the text predictions from Barcelona, we get data from the UCDP on conflict fatalities, and we get data from VDEM and a lot of other sources. But we vet these sources really, really well. We look into it, and they have all been verified scientifically multiple times by top tier journals. And as you could just hear at Katajun, a lot of work is put into these things. A lot of work, again, this data we have on conflict is vastly better than any data we have on populations. And still people tend to trust population data. So at some point I'm like, what can we even do? Because we are using the most scientifically, rigorously collected and methodologically prudent data. And still people are like, but are you sure? And we're like, it's the best data that we can possibly get. And I did. You know more about this than me, Ylva, but we did have a talk about, because you have your background a bit more in cybersecurity. Like, is it because we need certificates instead of saying this data set has been cited in a top journal? Do we need a small gold star saying this data set Kraft has said that this data set is cool? And then people will be like, cool. I don't know if that's the solution, but it feels at one point it's like we can't keep validating the data set. Like, you're doing a lot of work making sure it's okay. So I don't know. Yeah. No. Yeah.
Well, on our end, it's not that we collect on-the-ground data. We focus on newspapers, and we are increasing the quantity of newspapers and also the languages, and little by little increasing the source material. But what we were concerned were about publishing the data that we produce. And actually, this conversation has also been in the first panel and the second, because once you publish your information, you can get because these are like prophecies, so you can get self-fulfilling prophecies and self-defeating prophecies. And depending, because most of the outcomes that we predict are bad, you don't want self-fulfilling prophecies. So maybe on that end, you don't publish, or you make sure that this data set only gets to the actor that can make an action about it. But then if it's also self-defeating, if it's for the wrong reasons, like displacement, you don't want to publish your data set, as you were mentioning before, Geraldine. And in conflict forecast, we publish the data mostly on national level, and we believe that this is more self-defeating forecast for the good reasons, because people are going to do something to avoid the conflict to happen. That's why we also partner a lot with institutions that can make interventions to prevent conflict.
We need to move on. We have a question also from the lady on the corner here.
Hello, my name is Erika. Thank you for this very interesting conference. I'm not a researcher, I'm not a data scientist, I'm a legal advisor, and I'm trying to wrap my head around what's problematic with AI. And listening to you now, and also about the session earlier about funding, I just wanted to ask if you have experienced that funding depends on the variables in the models. And like, if a funding government is involved directly or indirectly in a conflict, is it likely that they will reject a project if it says something about this conflict? And also, if this happened, would this be a sort of bias? And how to secure trust and transparency in a scenario where questions of interference may be raised? And finally, if these models are or will be decisive or for decision makers, how do you consider your role in a democratic society? Thank you.
Just small questions.
Yeah, you got 5 minutes.
Can I do a plug for Craft? So I mean, I think Craft actually is a great example of getting around this problem, because it's not one country giving you money for one very specific project. It's a pool of money from different governments that have all said, this is a generally important concept to us that we want to fund. And then you are applying maybe with a specific project. In the case of ACLED, for example, it helps fund just our existence, like the ongoing kind of work that we do. But in some cases, it might be tied to a smaller or much more specific project. But it means that you're not beholden to, one very specific donor that has an agenda. Because I do think, yeah, you're right, that can very quickly lead, unless you have a lot of guardrails in place up front, that could lead to either them directly impacting the results, or even if they don't, it at the very least causes people to look at your results, critically. So I think it's a great funding instrument.
But you skipped the part. Do the funders ever ask you to build a certain, do they give you
I have never
freedom to build
that.
whatever you want?
Yeah, I've never had a funder directly ask us to do anything, put our hand on the scale at all, no.
We had. Can I talk about the FAO project? Is that
This is a recorded
All right,
event.
so I'll just keep it very,
remind
very
everyone.
vague. I'll just keep it very, very vague. We had a discussion with some people that wanted to make
Someone who is not the FAO.
yeah, someone who is not the FAO. But it was just a pilot looking into how our forecast could help in different scenarios. And they were a bit unkeen on the fact that we used conflict history to forecast future conflict. And we were like, but that is by far the best predictor. And they were like, yeah, but we don't really like it. And we were like, this is. But after a lot of conversation back and forth, kind of aligning, what does it even mean to forecast? How does this forecasting? Then, it got sorted out. But we were asked to start with to, could you not do that? And we said politely no. So. But I do know that way back, the Political Instability Task Force, they were asked to not have the US in their data set. And they actually didn't disclose that in any of their academic articles. It was, I think, Gary King that made a report of the article that was like, maybe dudes say that you don't have the US in your data set because that's a bit shifty. But they were funded by the CIA, so there you go.
Since we try to make sure that our methodologies for most of the projects that we build are published, and therefore peer reviewed, and therefore the decisions that we make have to be validated by valid reasons. So that's one way of shielding from interferences, because otherwise peer review wouldn't pass it. So that's what we do.
Hi, fascinating conversation, and just would also like to thank all of you for all the hard work you do, because it's very central to certainly what we do at IEP, but also just the broader community. I guess the question I have, so we've got a lot of great work going on across a lot of great organizations, but we all seemingly have the same frustration that it's not really being used broadly, or at least in the way that we envisioned. We talked about magic wands in the last panel. If you had a magic wand, what do you think would be the one thing that you would change in the conversations that you've had in your experience to try and get these used more with the sort of partner organizations that you've worked with?
Oh, if I had a magic wand. Yeah. Okay. Somewhere in the questions for the day, that was the document that you sent us, was this institutional part of who is the one responsible of doing prevention on conflict. And right now you have several agencies or several institutions. So if I had a magical wand, maybe it will be more global in a sense, or at least, but more. The efforts will be better organized. That way you can have just someone that can ask for several models to tackle the several interests that they have, for the several policies that they have. I guess that will be the more efficient way. But it's not that I have think a lot about it, because that could also have a lot of cons, which probably people here can think of better than me. But yeah, that will be my magical wand.
Can I have 3 wands?
Yeah.
Then I would like more money for craft. That I agree with Katajun. That's great work. I would like policymakers and stakeholders to understand that humans are also biased. We had a conversation with Red Cross, and they were like, "But have you thought about automated drones? Could be killing civilians?" And I was like, "Yes, but humans are killing civilians also." And lastly, I would like stakeholders to think more about, would they do better than they're doing now if they use the model? So instead of thinking like, absolutely, how good are the models, just think, if you were using that data, would you just do a little bit better, a little bit more efficient? Because I think that would further the discussion and be a bit more fruitful.
I think also building off of Simon's point, I think getting policymakers to understand, it was said in the previous session as well, that it's all of these models, these tools are meant to be a starting point, right, for further analysis and discussion and resources. And so I think policymakers have to understand that they're never going to be the end all be all. They're never going to answer exactly the question that they do. And so following it up with analysis. But all of this, I think, is getting better. I will say that. I think, especially, in the US, we see these models increasingly integrated into government systems, into corporation systems, like Meta is using it now too. And in US government legislation, where they're actually using these tools to identify the countries that they're going to prioritize for prevention or peace building. And I think IEP's Peace Index is, along with ours, mentioned in the Global Fragility Act of 2019 in US government. So I do think it's getting better. Just my positive spin on things. To contrast, Simon.
Well done, you.
Yeah, I think my magic wand would just be getting data. So in my case, ACLA data, and just increasing the awareness of it across these organizations. So I find that most of the time, once we familiarize people with like this data exists and it's out there and this is how we collected it and why you can trust it, the overwhelming response is really positive. And they're like, oh, this would actually be really helpful for what I'm doing. The problem often is that they're just generally unaware that it exists. And so a lot of the times the people that I talk to at an organization that know all about ACLID and use it all the time is the data team, right? Or it's like 5 people that are pretty siloed even within that organization. And they're fighting the good fight to get everyone else to use it. But often, that's really difficult as well. So just getting awareness more, because I think if people knew about it, they actually are quite open to using it. And then we can get them hooked on the more complicated models.
Oh, I will add just one that I forget. So, since from policymakers the why is very important, then if we want to explore more on the whys, we need a comprehensive, timely updated data set structure on policy interventions. Otherwise, I don't know how.
Yeah, to build up on what everyone else has said, this is most in my case, but the realistic expectations is nice. Not as, but yeah, because to build on that time, because I don't think a lot of people understand how much time it takes to actually build these models, and just testing them, training them, and yeah, so time and realistic expectations, and also a lot of compute would be nice. Access to compute.
Nice concrete.
Lots of compute.
Yeah.
That's a great way to end the nerdy panel. We've almost on time. That's also the final panel of the day. Thank you very much to the panelists. Thank you very much to the organizers. We'll be back here tomorrow at 9 to talk how to tackle AI misuse. So come back then for exciting news.